This introduction unpacks the theories and assumptions that underpin this book.
This introduction unpacks the theories and assumptions that underpin this book. It brings together what might seem to be a disparate collection of topics, all of which can impact on your thesis writing. The aim is to help you understand the context for your writing, an important first step in any writing project, and to learn from the literature on academic writing. Although there is abundant research on writing, it has not been fully integrated into the research process. What knowledge there is concerning the actual PhD process is scant. The British literature on the academic writing role is similar to that on research, patchy. The terms scant and patchy suggest that there is work to be done on establishing how best to manage the thesis writing process. In fact, much of the literature emphasizes the importance of the research, with the writing process receiving less attention. However, useful lessons can be drawn from existing research, and there are established strategies that you can adapt to the writing of your thesis. Basic premises of this book are that you have to find out what is expected of you as a thesis writer, and write from the start and keep writing throughout your research. What this constant writing involves will vary from one person to another, but there are core principles which, if you know what they are, help you to write regularly and effectively. Writing a thesis is a completely new task for most postgraduate students. It brings new demands. It is a far bigger project than most students will ever have undertaken before. It requires more independent study, more self-motivation. There is much less continuous assessment. It is likely to be the longest piece of continuous writing you have ever done. However, writing a thesis is not a completely new experience. It does build on your previous studies. Skills you developed in undergraduate years and elsewhere will be useful. Time management is a prime example. The subject of your thesis may build upon existing knowledge of, for example, theoretical approaches or the subject itself. The discipline of study, or regular work, is just as important as in other forms of study you have undertaken at other levels. Early writing tasks. 2. Introduction. Passively accepting that a thesis is one of life's great unknowns is not a sensible course of action. Like any other writing task, it can and must be defined. One of the first and best books to outline the whole process for the PhD is How to Get a PhD by Phillips and Pugh. What Phillips and Pugh did for the doctoral process, this book does for the doctoral and master's writing processes. The two books can be seen as complementary. This book focuses on that writing process and provides activities, prompts, and hints and tips for writing at each stage in thesis writing, right from the start. Writing a thesis should not be one long catalog of problems. Once you have a repertoire of writing strategies, you can get on with writing, recognizing that at some points in your research you have factual or descriptive writing to do, while at others you have to develop more complex and persuasive modes of writing. You can also use writing to develop your ideas, consolidate new knowledge, and refine your thinking. This book gives you strategies for all of these, so that thesis writing becomes a series of challenges that you work through, gradually establishing what type of thesis it is that you are writing. Writing your thesis with these strategies to hand should maintain the intellectual stimulation and excitement that brought you to research in the first place. Although the terms thesis and dissertation have different meanings in different cultures, the term thesis is used in this book to refer to both undergraduate and postgraduate writing projects. Since these projects can vary in length from 8,000 words for undergraduate projects to 20,000 words for master's projects to 40,000, 50,000 words for professional doctorates to 80,000, 100,000 words for PhDs. Readers are prompted throughout this book to develop frameworks and timescales to suit their own projects and within their institution's guidelines and regulations. Similarly, while the person who works with a thesis writer can have many titles, tutor, advisor, etc., the term supervisor is used in this book. What the students say. Found a discrepancy between graduate students and faculty as to what constituted effective scholarly writing, discovering that students wanted to learn how to write more concisely, follow a prescribed format, and use correct terminology. Faculty, on the other hand, felt that students needed to improve their ability to make solid arguments supported by empirical evidence and theory. This is an interesting dichotomy. Then again, why would we expect two very different groups to have formed the same expectations? Presumably research students are still learning what it is they have to learn. What the students say. 3. Even when the subject of writing is raised in discussion between student and supervisor or among students as it should be, there is no consensus about what they need to know. What do those who have started or completed a thesis say, looking back, that students need? The answers to these questions are multifaceted, they may even be contradictory. These responses show how writing is related to, and can be influenced by, all sorts of factors. Students report that they look for lots of different kinds of advice and help. Many, if not all, of their concerns can be related to their writing. Some will directly affect their writing practices and output. What is provided in the way of support and development for writing seems to vary enormously from institution to institution and even from supervisor to supervisor. Some of these problems can be interpreted as the result of students' lack of awareness of what's expected, of what is involved in writing, and of what the educational experience involves. There is, often, the additional problem of lack of research training, although formal training is commonplace in some higher education systems and is becoming more common in others. We must assume that supervisors want their students to complete their theses on time. They are not out to put barriers in your way. However, their role is complex and is sometimes left. Looking back, it takes a long time to strike a balance between what you want to do and what the supervisor wants. You can waste as much as a year. It's difficult to get supervisors to give priority to your project. Supervisors are sometimes not that interested. This is a problem for all students. Isolation can be a problem. It can come with any of the other items on the list of problems. Start with a plan. 6 months or a year can drift away very quickly. It's important to write as you go along. For introduction. Implicit for too long. Supervisors are not always aware of specific writing problems or established writing development practices. Some admit that they don't know what they don't know about writing. They have all completed a thesis themselves and therefore have knowledge of the writing process. They will have probably published papers and/or books. They may have supervised the writing of many theses. However, the amount of reading they do about academic writing is likely to be variable. Some own up to having forgotten what their own research and writing apprenticeship involved. This book takes a holistic approach to the total process of writing a thesis. While focusing on writing, some of the related topics raised by students will be addressed. The aim is to help you complete this particular task while, in the process, developing strategies and skills that will be useful in other writing contexts. You can use these strategies at any stage in the process, not just at the start, although they have particular importance at the start in getting you to start writing. Students and supervisors who read drafts of these chapters said that what students look for is more direction, not just questions to stimulate their thinking. They want to be directed to good writing style. They want to develop the skills of argument. Students may not be able to say this right from the start, they may not know what they need. They may only understand that this was what they needed when they get to the later stages in their projects, or right at the very end. This book aims to help you develop your understanding of the writing process, not just the finished product, through reading, writing, and discussion with your peers and supervisor. A writer's toolbox. There was a view among the student writers that good writing came spontaneously, in an uprush of feeling that had to be caught at once. I want to suggest that to write to your best abilities, it behoves you to construct your own toolbox and then build up enough muscle so you can carry it with you. Then, instead of looking at a hard job and getting discouraged, you will perhaps seize the correct tool and get immediately to work. These two statements reveal the journey on which this book hopes to take readers. Your point of departure is the popular misconception that good writing happens when it happens, that writers should wait till they are inspired, and that, if they do, the writing will flow. Your destination is the development of a toolbox of skills that writers can use for different writing projects and for different stages in any writing project. By the end of this journey, you, a writer's toolbox 5, should be able, using these skills, and with the confidence they bring, to get immediately to work on any writing task. Stephen King's toolbox image chimes with what writers say in writing groups, as they are developing their writing skills over a 6 to 12-month period. They find that they procrastinate less, and they certainly do not wait for any kind of uprush of inspiration, but are content to get something down on paper immediately and then work on that to produce a finished piece. This represents quite a change for many writers, a change in behaviors as much as a change in conceptions of writing. It may seem inappropriate to use creative writers throughout this book, since they are different from thesis writers in so many ways. They have always wanted to be writers. They write all the time. They have come to know what works for them. How can that help you? However, what is helpful, particularly when their subject is the writing process, is that they have developed and refined tools and tactics that we can use and adapt. They can teach us that we can fit writing into our lives and still have a life. More importantly, they can show us different ways of learning how to do this. The material covered in this book has evolved over 15 years of thesis writing and research supervision courses. It has been tested in writers' groups, where postgraduates and academics have commented on drafts of this book, requesting, for example, that specific topics be dealt with and that lists of cogent questions designed to prompt reflection be replaced with guidance to prompt action. The book covers the 3 main stages of thesis writing: Chapters 1, for deal with strategies for getting started, Chapters 5, 7 with working towards closure, and Chapters 8, 10 are the endgame, pushing the thesis towards completion. Each chapter in this book takes as its focal point a different strategy for writing. Of course, a good thesis writing toolkit is more than a source for a certain number of words, just as a thesis is more than a simple total of a number of words. Clearly, length is one, and some would argue the least important, criterion. It gives no indication of the quality of the work or of the writing. Quality in the writing is far more important than the number of words. However, quality comes through many revisions. In the early stages of such a long writing project as a thesis, it is not appropriate to aim for that type or level of quality. Early stages, early writings, and early drafts will surely lack the qualities expected in the final polished product. Writing that is sketchy, incomplete, tentative, and downright wrong is an inevitable part of the research and learning processes. This is why you have supervisors. Writing is as good a way as any of testing your ideas and assumptions. Learning strategies for and developing a facility for generating text have, in themselves, proved to be important processes, more important, some would argue, than learning the mechanics of writing. Being able to. 6. Introduction. Write on demand is also a confidence booster for novice writers. It stops them from procrastinating and helps them get started on those early drafts that are, after all, called rough for a reason. The title of this chapter is so important because it raises one of the key issues. It is possible to become productive, lifelong writers using a variety of strategies. Adopting these strategies will be a more comfortable process for some writers than others. The strategies may initially appear useful at some stages in thesis writing and less so in others. The title of this chapter may also prompt interesting discussion among students and supervisors as to what does constitute good writing practice and a quality written product. Productive writing, however, may require you to use more than one tool, perhaps several quite different tools at the same time. For example, 1,000 words per hour is a feasible rate of writing when you know what the content is to be. If we have a detailed outline, we can write to order. However, for thesis writers who are still learning about the subject, this may not be possible. They will have to sketch structures. They will have to make choices before or during writing in any case. They have to live and write with uncertainty. With thesis writers in mind, this book includes strategies for generating text with and without structure. It also provides prompts for additional thinking about structure. Since thesis writers may not be conscious of how to use a generic framework as a starting point, generic frameworks can help you shape your unique thesis structure. In other words, this book is based on 3 key principles: learning comes through writing, quality comes through revision, and regular writing develops fluency. With these objectives in mind, it is possible to build up to writing 1,000 words an hour, even though the whole thesis is not written in that way. There may be some debate about whether the learning involved is about your topic or about your writing, but both apply. They are, in any case, interconnected. Over the longer term, perhaps by the end of this book, it will be possible to write 1,000 words an hour. This is not just about speed writing. With the strategies and concepts in this book, the writer will be better equipped to decide when and what he or she can and cannot write at this rate. Writing 100 or 1,000 words in an hour or a day will be an active decision rather than a wait-and-see passive process. The wait-and-see approach has another potential disadvantage: you may learn less about writing, you may not develop as a writer. There are those who think that writing ability is innate, that it is not learned. However, the fact that writing is not taught beyond a certain level of school or undergraduate education does not mean that it cannot be learned. The 1,000 words an hour method may require a certain level of writing ability, but the argument of this book is that the ability can be developed. This takes time. Like the novice runner who, after a few short runs, asked, "When does runner's high set in?" expecting the effect to be immediate, you have to work at it to see the benefits. It might also be a good idea to improve your keyboard skills. A Writer's Toolbox 7. An analogy for word counting is taking your pulse while you are exercising or training. The number of heartbeats per minute tells you more accurately how hard you are working than does your own impression of effort. You may feel that you are really toiling up that hill or round that track, but if your heart rate is already in your training zone, say 160 beats per minute, then you know that you do not have to increase your workload. You may be working hard enough already to achieve the desired effect. For any number of reasons, you may not be able to interpret effort as actual output. Having a concrete measure can help you adjust your perspective. With writing, counting the number of words is a way of getting a more accurate measure of output. We may feel that we are, or are not, doing enough writing, yet if we have 1,000 or 100 words an hour, whatever the rate we set out to achieve, whatever we judge a realistic rate to be, then we know we are making progress. As with exercise, taking the heartbeat of our writing can save us from trying to do too much and from feeling guilty about not having done enough. More importantly, it can become a way of establishing momentum. We can track the regular flow of our writing. A rate of 1,000 words a day produces 5,000 words at the end of the week that were not there at the start. This can be a powerful motivator. Setting a realistic pace and calibrating it from time to time is important as you start to build regular writing into your life. Again, finding some way of measuring output can provide insight into the goals set. Are you trying to do too much? If you want to work up to writing 1,000 words an hour, having never done so before, should your goal not, initially, be much less than that? How much would be sensible? A thesis is incomplete for a number of years. It is helpful to have a sense of work that has been completed, even if not to a final stage. Since closure is deferred again and again, it is helpful to create mini closures along the way. The writer has to find some way of marking progress. It does not matter too much which method you choose for defining your writing targets. Do the best you can. Counting words, setting goals, and acknowledging increments are ways of recognizing your progress. The beauty of counting is that it is simple and concrete. Not everyone will be fascinated by numbers of words. There must be some writers who would find this approach too simplistic. Some will be disgusted at the apparent reduction of their highest ideals, original research, tough concepts, first-class writing skills to a set of sums. But this is just one way of establishing a set of patterns for an extended writing process. It is not the only way. There can be more than one. For me, the fact that I just wrote 442 words of this chapter in 20 minutes, between 9:05 a.m. and 9:25 am, will not grip every reader, but it does tell me what my actual pace of writing is just now, and it does show me that I have achieved something in writing. In fact, given that 1,000 words an hour is a high, in my view, rate of output, I can reassure myself that I am being productive. The question of whether productivity. 8. Introduction. With its associations of other contexts is enough, I ignore for the moment. Quality will come with revisions. I also recognize that I am and others may be able to write this way with some subjects and not others. I have worked on thesis writing for 15 years, but thesis writers may have worked on their subject for as little as 15 weeks, 15 days, or 15 minutes. Theoretically, most students and supervisors will probably say thesis writers need more thinking time. They can't just churn out text at the rate of 1,000 words an hour. The students and supervisors might add, and it's just as well, it would all be rubbish. It might, in one sense, be rubbish. Students might, in the early stages, rush out writing that is tentative, full of uncertainties, rambling, and wrong. But is this rubbish? Another way of reading such writing is to say that the student is still learning to write and using writing to learn. Rambling writing may indeed signal rambling thinking, but it may also be a first step for students in understanding their subject. I can hear supervisors and students saying things like, "But what is the point of doing bad writing?" And my response would be, "Isn't producing writing that you're not happy with, that you know you have to redraft many times before you submit it for public scrutiny, an acceptable part of the writing process? Does this make our writing bad writing? Or is it more accurate and helpful to the novice to call it writing on the way to being good writing, i.e. a draft? But if not this, then what?" There are many ways of doing this, but if counting words or pages seems so unusual, if not wrong, to a thesis writer or supervisor, what does this say? What does it suggest about how they conceptualize writing? How will they define increments and stages? How will they break that down into actual daily writing practices? These questions are not simply meant to be rhetorical, although they are frequently treated as such, but are meant to prompt discussion so that thesis writers develop their own answers. Whether this point represents a real shift in thinking, even reconceptualization about writing, or whether it's just a way of renaming things, there is a point to be argued here about making explicit what are often left as assumptions about writing practices and products. Opening up the multiple draft writing process for discussion, for example, can boost students' confidence. They realize that producing bad writing is sometimes part of the process and the arithmetic of writing. How will you measure your written output? How will you identify the pace of writing that suits you? How will you establish momentum in your writing? A Writer's Toolbox 9 may, at times, be such a necessary part of the process that we would do well to find another name for it. Supervisors shape thesis writers' conceptions of writing, but students can develop a number of different tools for writing without going against what their supervisors recommend. It is not the purpose of this book to create conflict between students and supervisors. However, given the potential for debate about writing, perhaps it is understandable if writers do not agree all the time about what works best. Given the range of strategies available, though supervisors and students may not have heard of them all, it is inevitable that there will, and should, be discussion of what works best, what that means, and how we know. It is to be anticipated that out of any set of new strategies, one, or more, will seem immediately sensible and practical to the individual writer, while another will seem pointless and inappropriate for a thesis. For example, writing on demand is a theme of this book. Helping students to find ways to force their writing throughout the 3 or 6 years is one of its goals. If we accept that having a range of strategies, or at least more than one, is, in principle, a good idea, then there is every chance that some of the strategies in this book will not only be new, but may also seem counterintuitive. We have been writing in our own particular ways for so long, presumably, something has to change if we are to write a much larger and much more complex document. However, initially that change in writing approaches, that simple broadening of our options, can seem uncomfortable and just too challenging. A thesis requires the writer or provides opportunities for writers to experiment with new techniques. If a thesis is different from any other kind of writing, you need to consider other strategies. When asked to try specific activities for forcing writing by writing without stopping for 5 minutes, writers often ask, "What can I write in 5 minutes?" In fact, this question is frequently rhetorical. What can I possibly write in 5 minutes? Many people report that it takes them 30 minutes to get into the writing. Before we go any further, that is worth noting as a future talking point in itself. What are people doing in those 30 minutes of warm-up time? Do they have routines for getting themselves started? Does that really have to take all of 30 minutes? Can that really be the only way? Aren't other options available? The purpose of this activity is to prompt writing, even at an early stage, when the thesis writer may not have a clear idea of where his or her project is going. The temptation at this stage, for obvious reasons, is to aim for a coherent proposal statement and thereafter other formal writing. However, examining and adapting your writing practices and assumptions is an important part of the writing process. For this activity, you can also take time to react to the propositions so far covered in this chapter and to consider how they might help you write your thesis. 10. Introduction. You may not be able to write 1,000 words an hour yet. The point is that you can write to order X number of words when given a prompt and a time limit. This effect can be extended. Using all the tools in this book, it is feasible to write 1,000 words in an hour, even for a thesis. Forcing writing, writing quickly without stopping, writing immediately without planning has potential benefits. There's plenty of opportunity for self-doubt. If I write rapidly, I find that I can keep up with my original enthusiasm and at the same time outrun the self-doubt that's always waiting to set in. The point is not just to keep up enthusiasm for writing, though that, too, is important, but to keep a focus on what you are thinking, forcing yourself to find a way to ignore or defer any self-doubt that may occur. There is, of course, nothing inherently wrong with self-doubt unless it constantly stops you writing. In fact, self-questioning is probably a key skill for researchers. Principles of academic writing. There are principles of writing in each academic discipline. It is up to you to locate and learn them. Find out what they are. You can do this by reading examples, publications, and theses, and discussing your developing understanding of core principles in your discipline with your supervisor and peers. As you read examples of academic writing in your discipline, it might help to ask the following questions. What are the conventions of writing in this discipline? What language, nouns, verbs, links, etc. do writers use? How are debates represented? How is the researcher represented, if at all? Writing activity. What can I write in 5 minutes? 1. Write continuously, non-stop, in sentences on this question. What do you think of the idea of writing 1,000 words in an hour? 2. Count the number of words you wrote. Principles of academic writing 11. How is structure revealed? What are the options in style and structure? Just as there are dominant issues in the debate in your discipline, so there are terms that are in and out of current use. Whether you see this as a matter of intellectual fashion or not, it is up to you to recognize the language in which the conversation you are entering is being conducted and to use, interrogate, or challenge it as you see fit. The literature on writing. I presume that most thesis writers do not need a detailed survey of the literature, but might query approaches that are not underpinned by research and scholarship. The relevant literature is wide-ranging in approach and outcome, and the following overview is intended to demonstrate different schools of thought. Boyce found that a daily regimen of writing makes academics productive writers. Brown and Atkins defined the problems thesis writers face. Poor planning and management of the project. Methodological difficulties in the research. Writing up. Isolation. Personal problems outside the research. Inadequate or negligent supervision. Elbow challenged the traditional view that we must first decide what we want to write and then write about it, arguing that we can use writing to develop our thinking. Emig argued that writing is a mode of learning. Flower and Hayes argued that cognitive processes how you think affect composition. Harrington defined the functions of writing tasks in educational settings, indicating, perhaps, what we might expect to have learned from them as undergraduates. Introducing academic conventions. Introducing professional conventions. Showing knowledge of relevant conventions. Exercising independent thinking, actively engaging with the materials of knowledge. Hockey explored the psychosocial processes of thesis writing and the doctoral experience. 12. Introduction. Lee and Street argued for an academic literacies approach, suggesting we should set about systematically learning the discourse of our disciplines. Murray argued that many different approaches and practices, working together, are needed for the development of a productive writing process, i.e. cognitive, psychosocial, rhetorical. Swales made a case for learning the genres of academic writing, and Swales and Feek demonstrated a genre-based approach in a textbook for non-native speakers of English that has relevance for native speakers. Torrance et al. Found that neither learning about the technical aspects of writing nor developing cognitive strategies for writing were as effective as strategies for generating text. A theme in the literature is that there are writing tasks throughout the thesis process, aimed at developing the thesis as an integral part of the research process. If this integration is successful, the student can become a serial writer, i.e. develops the writing habit, learns to find ways to fit writing into a busy schedule, and makes writing one of the parallel tasks of professional life. Developing fluency and confidence requires regular writing. When we write regularly, writing is still hard work, but not as intimidating. Other writing tasks become easier to do, it becomes more difficult to procrastinate. The key is learning how to focus. The end result is that you can be confident about your writing, knowing that you can meet deadlines. Harrington's naturalistic studies show how students construct themselves in the discipline, but also show that each course represents a distinct discourse community. It could be argued that each thesis is potentially situated in the same way. The thesis sits not just within the distinct discourse community of the discipline, but, in fact, within a smaller, though no less complex, subset of that disciplinary discourse. Should supervisors explicitly, not just implicitly, seek to develop these different knowledges and functions in their students' writing? Harrington has provided evidence that academics do take on this role in undergraduate education through guiding, posing questions, making suggestions for revision processes that are familiar in the traditional student-supervisor relationship. The literature on writing 13. Disciplinary differences. Questions of theory and method. In particular, I would remind readers that these concepts mean very different things in different disciplines. In most subject areas, however, the synergy between hypothesis, theory, and method is absolutely central to the thesis's success. Even the words theory and method, so central to research, can have very different meanings in different academic disciplines. Within your discipline, there may appear to be a particular meaning attached to each, and you may find writing about them straightforward. Alternatively, you may find that these words denote areas of complexity that you do not yet understand. Writing about these core terms may, therefore, depend on which discipline you are working in, the type of work you are doing, and the method, if that is the word you are using, that you use in your research. Some of these issues you will work out in your discussions with your supervisor. For your thesis, the important question is not whether there are disciplinary differences, there are, but what the characteristics of writing in your discipline are. If you are coming to research and thesis writing after a gap from study, then you may benefit from a kind of academic writing induction. Your supervisor may be prepared to provide you with an overview of writing in your discipline and may help you with analyses of completed theses. If so, the trick is to focus not on the content, which is tempting when the thesis is in your supervisor's area of study and research, but on the way in which the content is articulated. You may find that this type of discussion produces more questions. How to analyze a thesis. Scan the contents page. What type of structure is used? Experimental narrative, other form of logical progression? What are the approximate relative lengths of chapters? Is this structure reflected in the abstract? Read the introductory paragraphs of each chapter. How is progression from chapter to chapter established? What are the main differences between chapters? Look at structure and style, long short sentences and paragraphs. Look at the language used, what are the key words? Types of verbs used, definitive, past tense or propositional. 14. Introduction. Then answers. Do not be afraid to ask what you might think are fairly simplistic or superficial questions. Once you start to analyze thesis writing in your discipline, you will notice that there are certain ways of writing about certain subjects. You may also notice that there are differences between different sections. There may be a factual, descriptive style of writing for reports of experimental studies or individual analyses of texts or transcripts, and a more discursive style for interpretations and syntheses of results. The more factual writing can be done as you do your experiments or analyses, so that details and differences are recorded as you do the work, and, potentially, more accurately than if you let time elapse between experiments and writing. Noticing such differences can help you see where different elements of your thesis will go and how you will write them. Of course, your thesis may be unique, unlike any other thesis, even in your discipline, yet it may share certain features that will help your reader find his or her way around it. At the end of the day, you can use existing thesis writing conventions as a framework or formula for your thesis, or you can transform existing conventions. The key is to write, in your introduction, what you do in your thesis, how it is set out and, perhaps, why you chose to do it that way. In some disciplines, such freedom is not an option, but in others you can, literally, invent your own structure. However, there may be a set of core elements that examiners look for, some kind of forecasting statement at the start, for example, or certain kinds of linking and signposting devices between sections or, more importantly, a clear indication of your thesis's contribution and how you have laid out evidence for that claim throughout the thesis. In the humanities and social sciences, one of the challenges that thesis writers face is locating writing. Where is writing? In the sciences and engineering, the structure of writing more closely mirrors the research process, and writing practices may be more integrated in research. It can be easier to see that for every research task there is a writing task. However, in the humanities and social sciences, students have to invent not only their own research question. Ask your supervisor. Why does the author use this term in this sentence? Why is that phrase repeated so often? Why is that section so long? Why is this other section so short? Why is that chapter divided up into so many sections? Will using the word limitations not weaken the thesis? Why does the author not just say what he/she means? Disciplinary differences 15. And thesis structure, but also find the writing practice appropriate to their work. They have to find a place for writing in their research. In certain disciplines, there are assumptions about student writing. For example, in the humanities it may be assumed that students who are about to start writing a thesis have certain writing abilities already. Some of these assumptions may operate, of course, in other disciplines. Some of them may be closer to the truth than the word assumption implies. With any unspoken assumption, it is difficult to know how generally accepted it is. However, because they are not all helpful to the thesis writer, it is worth discussing these assumptions with supervisors. Exploring your and your supervisor's reactions to these assumptions might be a useful way to initiate more detailed and relevant to your thesis discussions. You might find that you learn a lot about thesis writing, specific to your discipline, in this way. In the visual and other arts, there are other forms of thesis, other definitions of what constitutes research, and other modes of examination. Thesis writing may involve a form of active documentation. You may not have to provide as much justification of your work as is the norm in other disciplines. However, as with any discipline, it is your responsibility to check the institutional requirements and, probably, you will still have to demonstrate some knowledge of the culture of research. Beyond that, you may not simply have to give an account of the context for your work, but also to define its creative component. Defining what is required in the written form is, as for any discipline, a key initial task. The thesis writer has to find answers to questions about how practice-based research might be conceptualized as a dissertation argument, and where this theorizing might be located within the realm of the artwork produced, within a contextual form such as a related exegesis, or in some combination of the two. Assumptions about thesis writers in the humanities. They can already write well. Attempts to improve writing are remedial. The first writing students submit to supervisors is a draft chapter. Progress is indicated and assessed in terms of completed chapters. They are natural learners and independent thinkers. With good students, supervisors make few comments on writing. Students know how to correct problems in writing when they are pointed out. Drafting is key. 16. Introduction. Exegesis refers to an explanatory text which some see as unnecessary because the artwork should speak for itself and stand on its own, but which others see as requiring the intellectual apparatus of any other advanced study or research. Exegesis is the term usually used to describe the support material prepared in conjunction with an exhibition or some other research activity that comprises a visual research project. Exegesis is not merely a form of documentation that serves preliminary purposes, records in progress activity, or displays outcomes. It is all of these. In one sense, this is quite like the research and writing produced in any discipline. In other senses, and perhaps in practice, it can be very different. Like other disciplines, the visual arts use many different forms of inquiry and frameworks for conceptualization. Students often feel that they have to start from scratch in designing their theses, with each student inventing a new structure. However, some would argue that, in terms of structure, the differences between one thesis and another are minor, even superficial. In fact, one reader has asked, how are these different? Nevertheless, the headings on the right-hand side will look alien to some students in the humanities, social sciences, and business. Yet there are similarities with the left-hand column. Some will see the two columns as completely different, others will see them as much the same. The point is that we can adapt the generic thesis structure on the right in this box to many different contexts. It can be used as a framework for many different types of study. Its apparent home in science and engineering should. Generic thesis structure. Disciplinary differences 17. Not prevent us from making use of it as a starting point, at least. Nor is this structure just for experimental research. Every study has a method. Every study produces results, outcomes of analyses, of whatever kind. Some writers, in some disciplines, may feel that translating the scientific template is not a valid option. The headings do not translate into chapters, and this is unhelpful. That may well be true. You might not have such chapter headings and divisions. However, it is a starting point. It can be seen as representing the deep structure of many different types of thesis. It may, therefore, help writers develop initial statements on what are key issues for any thesis. The generic structure is a tool for writing and thinking. As a template, it can help us answer the key questions for a thesis. Whether or not this shapes chapters is another question. We may not all be drawn to it, some will be alienated by it, but even if you use it as an antagonist, it will prompt you to sketch alternative structures. If this structure and strategy seem wrong to you, that may be because you already have the germ of an idea for your thesis structure. Capture that on paper now. You then have some ideas you can discuss, and possibly develop, with your supervisor. Thinking about structure. In order to develop further your thinking about structure at an early stage, you could discuss the following questions with other writers and, of course, with your supervisor. Does your discipline have an implicit-explicit generic structure? Are there any book support materials on thesis writing in your discipline? If the idea of generic structure strikes you as strange since each thesis is different, then it might be a good idea to discuss this concept further. Have you discussed the overall structure of your thesis with your supervisor and/or peers? If you think it is too early in your research for this discussion, think about and discuss how the work you do in the early stages relates to the production of a thesis. If you do want to use a non-generic structure, then you should research and discuss that too. Will you be inventing a completely new structure? What are the precedents for this in your discipline? 18. Introduction. Prompts. At the very start of the thesis process, most writers feel they have nothing to write about. The instruction to just write seems absurd. Many will feel they have not really started anything while they are still reading and thinking about their project. The problem with this state of mind or concept of thesis writing is that it can continue for just a little too long. It is possible to think that you have nothing to write about for many months. In fact, the more you read, the more certain you may become that you have nothing to contribute to the debate, and therefore nothing to write. In order to combat this reluctance to write, since it cannot continue indefinitely, the chapters of this book have "What Can I Write About Now?" sections. These are to be used as prompts by students and/or supervisors for writing throughout the thesis, from start to finish. Any prompt can be used at any time. They can be adapted or rewritten to suit the individual. The main point is that writing occurs, text is generated. This approach antagonizes some supervisors and students. The word quality is the focus of their concern. Will the writing activities proposed here produce good writing? Possibly not. But, as was proposed earlier, and it is worth repeating because the quality question is paramount, we have to question the practice of applying the quality criterion so early in the thesis writing process. Is quality in structure, style, and content feasible at this stage? The quality of your writing on all of these criteria will be a focus for later discussions and revisions. This means that you should determine and discuss what the quality criteria are at any given stage in your thesis writing process. However, it cannot be assumed that this issue, or the proposed discussion, is straightforward. The concept of differentiating quality criteria may not be central to your supervisor's practice in providing you with feedback on your writing or, more importantly, in establishing criteria for you before you write. This means that you may come up against surprise, incredulity, or open hostility to the concept. Alternatively, your supervisor may respond very positively to the news that you have been reading and thinking carefully about thesis writing. It is likely, however, that some of the concepts and practices proposed in this book will be new to some supervisors, and you may find that, as with other aspects of your research, you have to participate in a debate about writing matters. Discussing the pros and cons of thesis writing strategies is no bad thing. You may in the process gain additional insights from your supervisor's experience and practice as a writer. Naturally, your supervisor may at any time alert you to any features of your writing that need to be improved. These early writing tasks often act as a kind of diagnostic test. Your knowledge of and ability in writing will be tested at every stage. You may feel that hard criteria are unfairly applied too very early. Prompts 19. Writing. Alternatively, you could be thankful that you have a supervisor who is willing and able to give you feedback on the quality of your writing. Some writers say that they can only write when they have a clear definition of the purpose of the writing task, but you may benefit from writing about quite general questions at this stage. This writing activity helps thesis writers find topics and focus on them. Establishing a direct link to your own interests, using plain English and the first person I, and actually writing about them are the key features of this exercise. Simply thinking about these questions, running over them again and again in your mind, will, arguably, not have the same effect. Writing will help you to develop your idea one step further. Not writing over the longer term may erode your confidence in your fledgling idea. Enabling student writing. Here is a set of expectations that you might have of your supervisor, specific to your thesis writing process. It might be a good idea to articulate your expectations or, if that does not suit you, to use these statements as a trigger for your discussions. Supervisors should give you feedback on your writing. Feedback will be variable. It might be helpful to discuss feedback on writing at What can I write about now? 1. What I am most interested in is. The books papers I have enjoyed reading most are. The ideas I want to write about are. 2. What I want to do with this is. What I want to look at is. The idea I keep coming back to is. Here are my ideas. Views. Feelings. On the topic. 3. The main question that interests me is. What I really want to do is. What I really want to say is. I want to find out whether. 20. Introduction. An early stage, even if you have not written much. The discussion will give you insights into what your supervisor is looking for and, perhaps equally importantly, it will give them insights into how you see writing. Supervisors should help their students set writing goals from the start of the thesis and all the way through to the end. This will help you to see the writing process as a whole, perhaps even to see the stages ahead of you and to see how you can plan time for them. Long-term goals can help you to plan your writing, while short-term goals make it manageable. Whatever the goals, the key point is that they are discussed and agreed by you and your supervisor. Otherwise, everything remains undefined, many aspects of writing are unspoken, and you may form the impression that you just don't write well. Supervisors should motivate students to start writing and to keep writing throughout the project. However, your supervisor may not want to put you under too much pressure. Your supervisor may feel that you have enough to do setting up the research or reading piles of books and papers and may agree to defer writing to a later stage. This may be a mistake. If writing is part of learning, you will miss out on an opportunity to develop your understanding. If writing is a test of learning, you may have no measure of how you are building your knowledge. This section can be summarized as a series of prompts for you to take the initiative with your supervisor so that he or she is able to enable your writing. Writing in a second language. Non-native speakers of English may require extra help with thesis writing. Alternatively, you may have more knowledge of English grammar and usage than native speakers. The Code of Practice on the Management of Higher Degrees undertaken by overseas students states that overseas students may require more supervision than others, perhaps for more than just the language differences. Since there are other layers of cultural difference that create specific challenges. However, is each supervisor aware of this code and able to give extra time to overseas students? Is it fair to expect this? How will you find out what you can expect from your supervisor? The highest standard of clarity and correctness is required in a thesis, and this does require some knowledge of grammar and punctuation rules. While all students are admitted to a university on the basis of satisfactory performance on one of a number of standard tests, the complexity of the thesis. Writing in a second language. 21. Process and product puts new demands on writers. You may find that you require further writing development or support. You are unlikely to know what you need, if indeed you need any further development or support, unless you have some form of diagnostic test. This need not be a formal test, just a writing task which lets your supervisor assess the standard of your writing. If your supervisor does not provide this, or does not ask you to write in the first few weeks or months of your project, you should offer to do some writing, so that you can get such feedback early. Then, if you do need to attend a course on English for academic purposes, for example, you will still have time to do so. If you need some other form of additional support, you will have time to find out where you can get it. If you need individual instruction, again, you will have time to find someone to provide it. Your spoken English may be equally important for the development of your research and in your relationship with your supervisor and peers. If you are an overseas student who is not yet entirely fluent in English, it is vital that you find out who is going to help you, particularly if you are not speaking English at home. Again, if your supervisor or department is prepared to take limited responsibility for helping you, you must check out what other sources of support your university offers. Many universities have a language support service dedicated to helping overseas students. Be persistent till you find what you need. Continuing without additional support is not a wise option. Does your supervisor see this as his or her role? How will you know? How can you find out? Will your supervisor be prepared to give you writing support in the earlier stages? He or she may do so, but may want to see that you can learn some of these things by yourself. Will your supervisor be prepared to give you detailed editing in later stages? Again, perhaps, but you must check. However, your supervisor will probably not be happy to continue to correct the same errors over and over again in your drafts. You have to take some action to improve your writing. Grammatical correctness in English often seems less important to students, but it has an important effect on your argument, particularly in the later stages. Poor sentence structure, for example, will obscure your line of thought and may even make your writing appear incoherent. Grammar, punctuation, spelling. If you do not know the difference between the passive voice and the active voice, or if you thought it was the active tense, then you may need to learn some of the key terms used in defining, and useful for discussing, the qualities. 22. Introduction of academic writing. You may need to study this area. Otherwise, your discussions with your supervisor may be confusing, as they use terms that you do not really understand, although you know you should, and they may expect you to. You can always ask them to explain them to you, but strunk and white. Combine definitions with illustrations to such good effect, in such a short book, that there is no need to go into such discussions completely unprepared. There are many other texts that cover this area. Your supervisor may recommend another text and may use other definitions of grammar that you will have to connect to your reading about it. More importantly, you might not understand what your supervisor is saying in any comments on your writing. How will you respond to this feedback if you do not fully understand it? Will you just press on with your writing and revising and hope for the best? Will you make some kind of revision without really knowing if you have responded to the feedback or not? This will breed uncertainty that you can undoubtedly live without. There are a number of terms you should be able to define and recognize in practice in reading and writing. Here are 10 questions that you can use to test your knowledge. If you know the answers to all of these, you are probably a student of literature or foreign languages. Perhaps your first language is not English, as it often seems that non-native speakers have more knowledge of grammar. However, if you can answer only 5 or none at all, this suggests that you have some work to do in this area. How much work, and how you will learn about these subjects, may be worth discussing with your supervisor. Remember that your goal is to produce excellence in your writing. It is not simply an exercise in pedantry to require that your subjects and verbs agree. Likewise, if your sentences are not well bounded, your argument will appear confused. You will appear confused. If you do not know exactly what you are doing when you are revising your own writing, this could undermine your quick quiz. 1. What are the definite and indefinite articles? 2. When and how do you use a semicolon? 3. What is a personal pronoun? 4. What is the antecedent? 5. What is subject, verb agreement? 6. What are the essential elements of a sentence? 7. Give examples of sentences using the passive and active voices. 8. What is the difference in meaning between the two? 9. Define sentence boundaries and say why they are important. 10. What is a topic sentence? Grammar, punctuation, spelling 23. Confidence as you write the thesis. That is exactly the opposite of what the process is meant to achieve. If you do not know the answers to the 10 questions, you need to read one of the many texts or sites on grammar and punctuation, or find some other mechanism for learning about these topics. Strunk and White. Fowler's Modern English Usage. Websites on writing. Online writing courses. Ask for help. Attend a course. Goal setting. This topic takes us right back to the question of why you are writing a thesis. You choose this track. You wander into the department. Before you know it, you have a stack of books and papers to read, meetings to attend, and classes to teach. Alternatively, you may have large chunks of unplanned time, which can be just as intimidating. The point is that however clear your goal was, you may have lost sight of it, not for the last time. It helps to have some way of reminding yourself of where you are going and why you chose to go there. Goal setting is about managing the long and short term. We can use a goal-setting process to help us to focus on both the immediate goal, the writing that we are doing now, and the long-term goal, the thesis that we have to produce. Somehow, we have to develop a commitment to both goals and deal with the tension between the two. Having the long view is being both energized and relaxed, enthusiastic and patient. It's knowing in the marrow of your bones this one paradoxical fact: writing's been around a long time and will probably continue at least as long, and yet it always happens in the here and now. What does this mean? Holding two contrary views in our minds throughout the project, from now until it ends? What is, for each writer, the long view? You have to form your own long view. Take a few minutes now to write about yours. Our goal may not be to become a writer, but the thesis writing process goes on for long enough that writing has to become a major part of our lives. 24. Introduction. Seeing things whole, having the long view, is the only way to live the writer's life. It's committing yourself to a concept of writing as an integral, ongoing part of your life, instead of just a series of external events. We have to see our writing process both as a long-term process and as a series of external events. We have to keep one eye on what's in it for us and the other on what they want me to do. In addition, there is value not only in seeing the project as a whole, but also in imagining the text of the thesis as a whole. We also need to construct an image of our life as a whole with writing in it. We then have to find a way of putting that into practice. In other words, there is more to goal setting than simply listing a sequence of actions. There is more to monitoring than ticking a box as we complete each task. The principle at work here is bringing definition to the thesis writing process. We create stages in the writing process. These stages are a construction. We can play the numbers game, setting very specific writing goals. The student has responsibility to create a series of writing milestones. Most people have heard of SMART, a snappy way of defining a good goal. In fact, there are two versions of this. One identifies external features of goals, representing goal setting as an objective process, and the second links goals to internal motivation. Version 2, because it focuses less on the outputs and more on values and emotions, may be more effective for creating writing goals that work. SMART version 1. Effective goals are specific, detailed enough to be measurable and convincing. Measurable. Achievable. Realistic, with no limiting factors. Time-scaled. SMART version 2. Simple, immediately understandable by you. Meaningful, to you, aligned with your core values. As if now, you can make it real to you, in all areas of your life. Responsible, for everyone involved. Towards what you want, not someone else's goal. Goal setting 25. Both supervisors and students may have reasons for shying away from goals. The supervisor may think this is too personal an approach, and may not want to put pressure on the students so early on. The student may be more comfortable talking about research goals than writing goals. However, there is evidence that goal setting improves performance in many different areas. Goal setting and self-efficacy beliefs can work in symbiosis. It may be up to you, once you have a general goal from your supervisor, to make it more specific, more workable. These approaches usefully remind us to adopt behavioral approaches, since changing and monitoring our behaviors, not just our thoughts, are what make up this new writing challenge. Hence the value of the arithmetic of writing. It sets concrete targets and gives real measures of output. Vague writing goals can cause problems. Not only is it difficult to ascertain whether or not we have achieved them, but a vague writing goal is difficult to start. If the writing task is not sufficiently defined, the writing process is itself ill-defined. Writers who have used the SMART process are only too well aware, once they step back to appraise their own goals, that they have left them ill-defined. They quickly realize that there has to be much more definition. Writing goals. Define the purpose of the writing task. Choose a writing verb: review, evaluate, summarize. Define your audience. Define the scale and scope of your writing. Decide on the number of words you will write. Decide how long you will take to write it. Poor writing goals. Do 5 minutes writing practice daily. Too big a change. Purpose not clear. Clarify topic. Scale and scope of the writing task unknown. Get feedback on writing. Type of feedback not defined. Recipe for misunderstanding. 26. Introduction. Not everyone works best by setting specific goals. Some find approximate goals more effective. Whatever you choose to do, it is important not just to have the long-term goal in view, but the short-term too. Not just the long-term goal of finishing, but the short and medium-term goals of starting, keeping going, losing the way, failing, changing direction, productive periods of writing, etc., i.e., all the unpredictable phases of a large writing project. How does your supervisor want you to set and monitor your goals? He or she may think the smart stuff is too gimmicky for higher education, or find the second version too personal, but if you find it useful, there is no reason not to use it to work out what your goals are. It is your goals that you have to agree with your supervisor, not your personal processes for working them out. Your goals provide a number of topics for discussions with your supervisor. If you are not confident enough to talk about your writing goals, you can at least discuss and agree your research goals, although you should define writing outputs for your plan of work. It is important to put your goals down on paper and get focused feedback on them. Goal setting requires feedback and monitoring, otherwise you will have no real sense of whether or not you are progressing. You will have to see how your supervisor wants you to set and monitor goals, but you may also have to take the initiative, indicating that you are ready for this discussion and, above all, ready to include writing in this discussion. A research methods group, or writers group that includes new students and those who are further along, can help students see how goals are set, what constitutes an effective goal, and what the whole thesis writing process involves. Lifelong learning. Academics should know better. Researchers have been nervous to let go to notions of scholarship, academic or pure research, specialisms, expertise, and the scientific method. We perpetuate the myth that education is a practice, and in so labeling it we separate it from what is everyday and for everyday. Good writing goals. Do 5 minutes writing practice today at 9:45 a.m. Define the topic in 500 words. Give it 30 minutes. Ask supervisor, is the topic becoming more focused? Lifelong learning. 27. Eliot reminds us that individual learners have the responsibility to make sense of learning in their own environment. You did not stop learning about writing when you completed your first degree. You are expected to have a high level of written and spoken English at the start of your second degree, but it is likely that you will develop these skills further in the course of the months and years to come. Writing a thesis can be seen as a development process. You will continue to learn throughout the thesis writing process. Some students get frustrated that they still have not quite made it in their writing, but that is a feature of the protracted learning process and the growing recognition that since we are always writing for new audiences, we are always learning about writing. Our relationship to our audience also changes as we become more knowledgeable and more known in our field. You may notice an emphasis on process in the course of your study, prompting you to think about, and perhaps document, the learning that you do in the course of writing your thesis. An emerging theme in doctoral discourse in the UK is the switch from content to competence, driven by a shift in emphasis towards the PhD experience for the student, and away from simply the outcome or the product. Whether you are doing a doctorate or a master's or undergraduate thesis, you may have to think about what transferable skills you can learn in the process. 5 minutes free writing. How do you want to develop as a writer over the long term? 5 minutes writing in sentences, private writing. It would be interesting to look back at your answer to this question at the end of your thesis. 28. Introduction. Audience and purpose. Audience and purpose are always the key in any communication act. What we write is shaped by the identity of whoever we are writing for and by our purpose in writing for them. For example, we present our research differently to departmental groups, to work-in-progress presentations and at conferences, where we create the impression of closure. The audiences, since there are more than one for a thesis, are analyzed in Chapter 2. However, it is important to consider how problematic audience can be for new thesis writers. Thesis writers have to write with authority when they may feel that they have none. While we know that we are not expected to produce high-quality writing and thinking in our first, or rough drafts, we have internalized the expectation of high-quality writing. This can present writers with a conflict. It can stop them writing anything. This is, therefore, an important talking point. What are the criteria for early writings, i.e. in the first few weeks and months? Is there adequate definition of the writing task, length, scale, scope, etc.? While much of the writing that you do in this phase and most of the activities proposed in the early chapters is not intended to generate text to be shown to your supervisor, it is important that you address the requirements of that audience too. Remember that when you write for your thesis, you are joining a debate. Anything you write can be challenged, not because your argument is weak or your writing is poor, but because that is the nature of the context. Entering the debate tentatively is probably a sound strategy. See yourself participating in, rather than winning or losing, the debate. See yourself making your point clearly, rather than demolishing or impressing the opposition. Expect some to agree and others to disagree with your points. This is inevitable in debate. This introduction has explored the theoretical underpinnings of this book. It has demonstrated how we can become regular writers by writing regularly. More importantly, it has begun to shift the responsibility for defining the writing process to the thesis writer. How others, including the external examiner, define writing will be covered in the next chapter. It defines the whole thesis writing process. Timetable for writing. Phillips and Pugh provide a graphic illustration of the timescale of the PhD, showing writing as a continuous and iterative element. Iterations have to be designed by the individual writer. If writing is iterative, then some tasks will appear more than once in your timetable. Timetable for writing 29. Revise proposal. Start constructing list of references. Summarize readings. Sketch background theory. Write research aims questions. Write about 2 or 3 possible methods of inquiry. Take time to develop your timetable. Writing task. Deadline. Writing time. Discuss your plan of work, including writing, with your supervisor. How will you monitor your progress towards your goals? As you gradually grasp what is required for a thesis and how your supervisor interprets that requirement, revise your short and long-term goals. Any, perhaps every timetable is there to be changed. Checklist. Defining the writing task. One student said she liked having checklists for chapters. You need to have checklists. They provide a route map on a long and complex journey. Some students say that they are so exhausted all the time that they need checklists to make it all manageable. Checklists clarify what needs to be done. Start writing now. Discuss writing explicitly with your supervisor. Read one book on writing in your discipline. Make up a rough timetable for writing. Set long and short-term writing goals. Find out about punctuation rules and grammar. Define audience and purpose for your writing. Discuss all of these subjects with your supervisor. Consider taking typing lessons. If you don't already have one, consider buying using a laptop. 30 Introduction. 1. Thinking about writing a thesis. Doctorate or master's? What is a doctorate? New routes to the PhD. Why are you doing a doctorate? Internal and external drivers, PhD or professional doctorate? Full-time or part-time? What will you use writing for? Regulations, how will it look on the page? Demystification. Codes and guides. How will my thesis be assessed? What are the criteria? Defining originality. What is the reader looking for? IT processes and needs reasons for not writing peer discussion and support. Your first meeting with your supervisor. Questions for reflection. Prompts. For discussion, writing timetable, checklist, pre-planning. Doctorate or master's. While several sections of this chapter focus on the doctorate, the issues and questions that are addressed are relevant to other levels of study. For example, finding out about institutional and departmental context and regulations is a crucial step in defining your task as a thesis writer. If you are intending to do a master's before your PhD, then this chapter will help you to think through your options and possible directions. The type of doctorate you intend to do in the future may influence the type of master's you do now. For example, if you want to use a particular research method, you might want to do a master's that provides the training you need, and then do a more independent form of doctorate, without research training, if you feel you are ready. This chapter proposes a structured approach to writing a thesis, promoting the idea of integrating writing into the research process. There is an overview of what this involves, including reflections on many strands of the writing process: psychological, social, and rhetorical. Arguments for writing throughout the thesis are proposed, and strategies for writing at the early stages defined and illustrated, using examples of real student writing. Commentary and annotations on these writings point out valuable strategies. Questions students usually ask about such arguments and strategies are addressed. The aim is to take readers and writers through a progression of skills, since it is assumed that the research process includes writing development. First, however, there are several sections of definition. What do the terms that frequently feature in research discussion really mean? What are the contextual factors affecting thesis writers? What structures, practices, and processes are typical of the doctoral thesis? To what extent are these relevant to master's and undergraduate thesis writers? These initial sections of this chapter are intended to help prospective doctoral students choose the program that suits them best and to help new students find their way in the program they have chosen. This should help both groups to find a place for writing in their research. What is a doctorate? The old or the new? Traditionally, the doctorate in the UK has consisted of 3 years of independent research. More recently, there is some interest in what is perceived as the American doctorate, meaning 4 years, including 1 or 2 years of coursework and research training. The pros and cons of each form of doctorate will no doubt continue to be hotly debated. The question is, which one suits you? Do you feel ready for independent research? The UK system assumes undergraduate education provides students with all they need to know to begin researching. It is debatable whether that is still true, particularly as universities try to keep up with the latest advances. Can you do, or do you want to do, a 1-year master's to prepare you for your doctorate? There is also the 1+3 mode, 1 year of training, plus 3 years of research. For example, the Wellcome Trust has a 4-year course that allows students to gain experience in more than one lab, as they 32-1, thinking about writing a thesis. Make up their mind which project to do for their doctorate. There is a precedent for this mode in psychiatry. We got a lot of training in modeling and statistics, but the main thing was being able to take part in various experiments. With other PhDs, you would have to say, "This is the title of my project," and been stuck with it 3 years later. Here you can work out what you want to do. However, this mode may not suit everyone. Those who know exactly what they want to do, and who want to get their doctorate started and finished as quickly as possible, may prefer the 3-year mode. The UK government has called for more formal training in the doctorate, partly in order to improve the research training component, but partly also to increase employability in sectors beyond higher education. I.e., the argument is that the doctorate should prepare people to conduct research in different areas, not just their area of specialization. Even in the humanities, the set of disciplines most wedded to the 3-year model, the Arts and Humanities Research Board, supports programs that include some form of research preparation, either in a taught master's or a tailored MA by research. Consequently, this may, or may not, be an explicit goal of an institution or an individual student or supervisor. It may be a factor in funding, program selection, and student recruitment. This may influence the writing project considerably. For example, there may be a requirement to demonstrate knowledge of wider applicability of methods and analyses. On the other side of the debate are those who argue that we demand too much from the traditional PhD. Gillen puts the representative case that a PhD should prepare a person for one career, not all possible careers. At the present time, those involved in the PhD process are overstretched. Students are no longer simply expected to carry out research leading to a substantial and original contribution to knowledge. On top of that, they are required to undertake teaching that is often tied to the award of a bursary, publish academic papers, acquire and develop transferable skills such as those of communication and project management, and, of course, write an in-depth and coherent thesis in the space of 3 years. To fit in so many tasks is difficult and often leads to deficiencies or more of these areas. While PhD graduates have to endure the criticism arising from such deficits, surely the blame lies more squarely upon the unfocused, haphazard process itself. There is another way of looking at this allegedly overloaded agenda. It would be surprising if a doctoral student were not encouraged, for example, in what is a doctorate? 33. Addition to writing a thesis, to submit papers for publication during the doctorate. Whether or not there is evidence of such deficiencies is a question to which we do not have an answer in Gillen's short piece. It may be logical to assume that where there is coursework, research training, and teacher training for higher education, there will be less time for the thesis, as some would argue. However, that logical assumption, if it is not formally part of your doctoral program, will have to be well planned, perhaps by you. Many supervisors will have been involved, though some not enough, in these transformations of the doctorate proposed or real at the local level. It is supervisors who still, in theory and in practice, develop the curriculum, if that is the right word, for each doctorate. The value of this system is that the doctorate can be customized for the individual student or supervisor, but the downside is that there may, as Gillen argues, be too much of a good thing, too many contradictory demands on the student. American universities have, for some considerable time, been combining the various elements, listed by Gillen as excessive, into coherent programs. That type of program, managed well, makes for an outstanding and comprehensive learning experience for the novice researcher. It is not, therefore, that the broader doctoral curriculum cannot be done well, just that it probably has to be managed at a graduate school level in order to become a coherent program. Can an individual supervisor be responsible for mapping that onto the demands of students and the requirements of employers? Or is that the work of another, possibly strategic, grouping in a university? This too is the subject of much debate. A key question for prospective postgraduates would be, for example, to ask if you will be given a teaching load a good opportunity to develop both skills and knowledge, and if you will also be able, or required, to attend a course on teaching. If there is such a course, for postgraduate tutors, then this is a sign that that element of the broader curriculum has been thought through, is being supported, and is more likely to be well managed. Then you can ask, is the course or program that you will be taking accredited, or not? A specific question that you can use to unpack the rationale of particular doctoral programs would be, what are the learning outcomes of the doctorate? In any case, this is an important question for individuals to engage with themselves before signing up to the doctorate. What learning outcomes are you aiming to achieve? The fact that Gillen referred to the PhD as the traditional form raises the question of whether there ought to be, or already are, different forms of, or new routes to, the PhD. 34.1. Thinking about writing a thesis. New routes to the PhD. The traditional PhD model is now being challenged by a growing diversity of types of doctoral degree, including PhD by publication, professional doctorates, and new route PhD. Traditional expectations of the PhD are being challenged by the new context within which research degrees are now situated and evaluated. While Park's paper on new variant PhD focuses on the UK, there are issues here worth raising before you commit to one mode of study, and some of the research, teaching, and professional academic tensions might also feature in master's programs. You might, as Park suggests, think beyond your research and your thesis to where it is that you want to get to professionally after you have completed your research. In most countries, there are many routes to the doctorate. Even universities in the same country or state will offer variations on the theme. Each has its own appeal. The trick for the individual applicant is to find the program that suits your needs and aspirations. One new route developed by the Higher Education Funding Council for England is designed as an improvement on the traditional UK PhD. Its explicit economic aim is to compete with the American PhD, but it has educational appeal too. It combines a research project with a coherent program of formal coursework in a seamless program of all components. The rationale provided by HEFs, who are sponsoring it, combines market-oriented and employability arguments. Why a new route PhD? The knowledge-based economy of today puts far greater demands upon doctoral graduates. There will always be a need for the subject specialist, but the competition for jobs in all sectors is increasing, and many find that having specialist knowledge is not sufficient. Increasingly, the traditional PhD is seen as too narrow, and students wishing to study for a PhD must carefully consider how employable they will be on graduation. This rationale, taken from the New Routes website, sounds a bit ominous. It does appear to offer more choice, although there is some evidence that student views have not been included in the design of this new route. 10 universities were initially invited to offer this new type of PhD. Their websites, accessible through this one, give details of what is involved. These university websites illustrate the content of 4 new routes to the PhD. 35. Example, the PhD with integrated study at the University of Birmingham. This route will take 4 years. 30 to 40% will be taught discipline-specific and interdisciplinary modules. The taught element includes skills training, e.g. communication skills, management training, etc. Perhaps more important, for prospective students and universities, is HEFS's statement about the future of this route. They propose that all PhDs will use this model. While this new route aims to compete with the American PhD, it is not offering the same components as are available at many U.S. universities, although it must be remembered that American higher education is an extremely diverse system, and therefore any generalizations about it have to be carefully considered. However, it may offer the nearest thing to it in the UK. It may attract more international students, thus creating a more cosmopolitan peer group. Independent evaluation provides more information on the effectiveness and experiences of this new form of the PhD. On the basis of that information, you can judge the success and suitability of this route. For individual doctoral students, the question of whether or not to follow this route may be decided by the simple fact of whether or not it is offered in their subject area or in the university they want to attend. This chapter provides summaries of and commentaries on such developments in the form of the doctorate. It might be worth checking the websites and publications of the different groups involved in order to keep up to date on what is available. Why are you doing a doctorate? Do you have an answer to this question? Have you discussed this with those close to you, with those who are most likely to be affected, directly or indirectly, by your studies? Do you have their support? What is your personal motivation? Is this a career-enhancing thing? Or are you seeking a post in higher education, for which this is usually a required qualification? Are you aware of the very small percentage of doctoral graduates who actually find employment in higher education? How much time and energy you see yourself spending on your doctorate is related to why you are doing it in the first place. What are you prepared to give up in order to make time for this? Are you interested in learning more about a subject? Or do you want to extend your knowledge of the whole field? A key factor, some would argue. The key factor in sustaining meaning and motivation through the long. 36.1. Thinking about writing a thesis. Doctoral process is the subject you choose. It has to be something in which you have a genuine interest. These questions are relevant to the writing of your thesis, since your sense of why your research topic is important should appear in some form in your introduction. More importantly, your answer to the question of why may strongly influence your choice of where and with whom. Leonard provides a useful reminder to intending students that they can pick and choose. If you are a good student, man or woman, home or international, and even if you are older than normal, you can be selective. It is therefore worth taking time and shopping around. Women in particular may lack self-confidence and feel flattered by, and accept too readily, early offers. However, it is a really important decision. Leonard's chapter on where to study, finding the right supervisor, and the right university talks readers through the key issues. Internal and external drivers. Do you feel excited about your research? Are you genuinely interested in finding out the answers to your questions? How will completing a doctorate change you, during and after the process? Are others ready for this change? What's in it for you? Do you stand to gain anything by doing a doctorate? Are you really doing it for yourself? Is there anyone else who wants you to do a doctorate? Who cares whether you succeed or fail? Do you have to do it? Do you have to do it for yourself? Or do you feel compelled or forced? How much will it cost? It is important to have both internal and external drivers, to have both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Goal setting, in the previous chapter, has hopefully revealed, for you, links between the two. Internal and external drivers 37. PhD or professional doctorate. These two degrees have different purposes and offer very different experiences. Do you see yourself as, or do you want to be, a scholarly professional or a professional scholar? The PhD is a 3-year piece of independent research. The professional doctorate usually includes coursework and research training, along with a shorter research project, usually shorter and smaller in scale, or a portfolio. The PhD is primarily an induction into an academic career. The professional doctorate emphasizes personal and professional development within the context of any profession. The PhD aims to make a contribution to knowledge. The professional doctorate is usually focused on improving practice within the profession that is the subject of the research. The professional doctorate is usually a structured program, including both coursework and a thesis. For the PhD, you work on a larger, independent project, with little or no coursework. Some people confuse the UK professional doctorate with the American PhD, but the two are very different. The professional doctorate may involve a substantial reflective process or piece of work, with you reflecting on your career or professional self. You could be asked to engage in searching dialogue about your professional development, values, and aspirations. Dialogue encourages critical reflection. What is the relationship, for you, between dialogue and critical reflection? This sounds like there would be ample opportunities to test your growing knowledge in peer group discussion. There may be more peer support here, built into the program. Is the assessment any different for the professional doctorate? Rajuri Stevens et al. Analyzed 16 DBA programs in the UK to see if the assessments matched the intended learning outcomes, and what they found was tension. The main conclusion is that there is a tension in the assessment methods employed by DBAs through their relationship with the traditional PhD. The tension is captured in the question: should program developers follow the assessment methods of the gold standard PhD, or should they use assessment methods that assess the learning outcomes of the DBA that distinguish it from the traditional PhD? Over time, this tension may resolve, but who knows how? The PhD, which in some contexts holds higher status, may cease to be the one and only gold standard. In fact, there may be several such standards already. Much more important, if you are contemplating either of these routes, may be the 38.1. Thinking about writing a thesis. Relevance of the particular degree, PhD or professional doctorate, to what you want to learn and research. If you are keen to make a contribution to the body of knowledge of practice rather than to fill a gap in the literature, then the professional doctorate will be the more appealing option. If the difference in the length of the professional doctorate thesis proves captivating 40,000 words, as opposed to 80,000 words, approximately, it may be worth adding up the total words required in assignments and thesis for the professional doctorate. Often, and quite intentionally, they come to around 80,000 words, i.e. about the same as the traditional PhD. There may be possibilities for publishing papers from your professional doctorate assignments. In fact, some professional doctorates explicitly include a module on writing a scholarly article that is then submitted to a journal. Once you have one or more papers submitted or published, you may be tempted by the option of PhD by publication, and you may find that it is relatively straightforward to transfer from the professional doctorate to PhD by publication. In other words, consider, before you start, or during your program, the relative flexibility of different routes to the qualification and written outputs that you seek. At the end of the day, the similarities between the PhD and the professional doctorate may be as important as the differences. Whilst the DBA, like the PhD, may have a program of complementary studies, it is not held to be a taught program, as its primary mode of assessment is through the production of a thesis. The authors are here quoting the Association of Business School Guidelines on the Professional Doctorate. The keywords are like the PhD. Their conclusions show that assessment in the professional doctorate proved to be less like the intended learning outcomes and more like the PhD. Our summative assessment is that the espoused assessment requirements of DBAs compare well with those of the traditional PhD, less well with guidelines, and least well with the espoused learning outcomes of the DBA programs themselves. For an excellent attempt to clarify matters, see Saros et al., the distinction between the DBA and a PhD, while understood implicitly, needs to be articulated unambiguously to potential examiners to avoid preconceived opinions of the DBA report as being similar to but lesser than a PhD, compromising the ability of examiners to perform their role dispassionately and appropriately. PhD or professional doctorate. 39. This suggests that, while you might think it premature, it might be a good idea to look at assessment criteria, i.e. those that are sent to and used by external examiners when choosing between one program or another. In addition, you may find that the growing number of doctoral and master's degrees in your discipline has been subjected to critical scrutiny or analysis. For example, in nursing, different forms of doctorate, their underpinning concepts and current understandings have been studied by an international group of scholars and educators. For consideration of the criteria for the professional doctorate, see Winter et al. For consideration of the differences in writing for each mode, see some examples of completed projects. Ask yourself the question, is there a difference between 40,000 and 80,000 words of sustained writing in the proposed discipline and department, other than the obvious one that the professional doctorate is usually shorter? There are, therefore, many issues to consider as you make the choice between professional doctorate and PhD: time, curriculum, supervision, flexibility, status, structure, and organization, among others. However, the final choice may also be influenced by the state of your finances or your judgment about how much you want to invest in your education. It seems evident that the capacity to pay rather than the underlying purpose and structure of the degree will become the prime differentiating feature between professional doctorates and the PhD. Capacity to pay may be affected by government policy, in the sense that national or local authorities can decide to fund one type of study but not another, so it is probably a good idea to keep an eye on funding trends and, of course, to assess the extent to which any funding sources would focus or restrict your study choices. Which mode? Which mode are you best suited to? Do both modes provide preparation for study? What new competencies will you be expected to develop? 41. Thinking about writing a thesis. Full-time or part-time? While there are obvious advantages to studying full-time, and part-timers often say they envy those who do, there are drawbacks. For example, going full-time means giving up pension years. You will have to buy back 3 or more years, and there is no guarantee that you will get a job and the pension that goes with it immediately after you graduate. On the plus side, you will have all of your time to devote to your research, unless, of course, you take on teaching, marking, networking, staff development, and finding a job, etc., as many research students do. The idea that you will have nothing to do but research and write may be less true now than it used to be, but many still consider the full-time route easier than combining it with a full-time job. The part-time route presents a different challenge. Part-timers often have different priorities from full-timers. It is tempting, but not helpful, for part-timers to compare themselves with full-timers. You have to learn not to overreach, to move at your own pace. Part-time study for a higher degree has become the fastest-growing sector of higher education. Funding is becoming ever more elusive, and the financial strain of taking years out of employment often renders part-time study the only route back into higher education. Part-time study will not make you a second-class citizen. There will be many others doing the degree this way. The trick will be to make contact with them. It's a nightmare part-time. In my situation, it wasn't even part-time, it was my own time. I only got 2 hours remission from teaching. There was no protected time at all. You may have less control over your time. Other priorities may nudge your research and writing aside, with more feelings of disruption, more gaps in the process. Design them in, plan for them. Take time to get back on track after a break, top entailing for continuity, using restarting strategies after a period of inactivity. You will have to take control of time. University attendance, research, and writing have to be carefully planned and scheduled with nothing left to chance. The part-time full-time decision has many factors. Many people will not have the luxury of choice in any case. The main thing is to be aware of how the two differ and not to get distracted by the path not taken. There is sometimes an element of the grass is often greener on the other side, in the views each has of the other. Full-time or part-time? 41. You will have to develop routines and regimens for writing regularly, strategies that are covered in Chapter 5. There is even more need for writing routines when you are juggling a higher degree and a full-time job. What will you use writing for? Doing a higher degree requires a fair amount of writing. What will you be using writing for? What do you see as its purpose? What purpose will writing serve for you, not just for the degree? You are writing to learn. You are writing to explore your research topic. You are writing to document. You are writing to report. You are writing to persuade. Is writing for you primarily a means of learning? Learning what? Learning what you know? What you do not know? To discover the limits of your knowledge? Or the limits of your apparent ignorance? Do you believe that we learn about what we think when we put our ideas down in writing? Do you agree that our thinking develops as we write our ideas down in formal ways? Are you setting out to learn from the feedback you get on your writing? Is writing something you see as a tool for recording what you think and do in your research? Is writing therefore a documentary process? All of these are relevant to the learning process that is part of the writing process. Each involves a different form of writing. Each assumes a particular response from the reader, assuming that either the reader knows your purpose or that you have specified it in your writing. It is also important to recognize that all of these ways of thinking about writing are in stark contrast to the more instrumental ways in which it is frequently regarded, i.e., as simply a means of communicating the results of research that is only part of the thesis writing process. What exactly does part-time mean? What part of your life can you give to your doctorate? A day a week? All day Saturday? Sundays? 42.1. Thinking about writing a thesis. It is always a good idea to make the audience and the purpose specific by writing it on the first page, and this is as valid for thesis writing as for other forms of writing. This piece draft paper has been written for. The purpose is to. That way, as your paper drifts away from its presently obvious context, as time passes, as your supervisor takes it home, as more time passes, as your supervisor sits down to read it in the airport train office, your writing will be read within the context you intended it. Probably. The supervisor is still likely to read it within his or her context, in relation to his or her ideas and experiences. All of the forms of writing covered in this section will shape how you write, for how long, how often, and in what form. These forms do not occur in a linear sequence, first one, then the other. However, they are probably all relevant for all theses. As the writing progresses, they are probably all occurring at the same time, in parallel. All the more reason to say explicitly, in writing, on the writing, which one you are doing at any one time. Of course, you may mix the different forms in any one piece of writing. Again, this is another reason for making specific what your purposes are in any piece of writing. Regulations. The most important document for a thesis writer is the university's higher degree regulations, or whatever they are called in your context. This will define what you are required to do. It will also explain the procedures for doctoral study and examination. Equally important, if your university has one, is the code of practice for postgraduates, or for research students, or, again, whatever it is called in your institution. Some universities provide ample information and support material on the web. Some of it is extremely helpful, although it should probably come with a health warning for you to check that it is relevant to your own institution's practice. You may find both regulations and guidelines there is a difference or both on such key topics as responsibilities of the student and responsibilities of the supervisor, length of study, examination, appeals. Departments may also have their own codes. Sometimes these are a reprint or photocopy of the university code, sometimes they have few or many major or minor changes that will affect you. You have to check, compare them carefully. Work out what they mean. Between the university's regulations and code, you should have the answer to most of your questions. Regulations 43. As you study your institutions or supervisors' answers to these questions, compare notes with other students. What have they found out? What has been their actual experience? What does the UK National Postgraduate Committee or other national student bodies say about it all? A thesis writing group can use some or all of these questions as talking points at one of their meetings. The question about upgrade from MPhil to PhD is one of the most important and is often seen by students as one of the more obscure procedures in doctoral studies. Having students register for an MPhil first gives the university and the student an early warning system. If, after 1 or 2 years, a student's work is not up to standard, he or she can be halted at this point. The advantage for students is that they do not walk away empty-handed from a year or two's work. If the work is up to standard, then the student's registration is transferred to PhD or to some other doctorate. The regulations and code of practice should be given to you when you register, unless there is some other form of communicating such information to you, on a website or some other form of publication. It may be up to you to check. You may also want to make sure that you get hold of a copy for each year of your registration, as regulations can change over time. Clearly, there will be many potential talking points for you in the code, or whatever document your university uses, for you, your peers and your university's regulations and codes. Do I have to register initially for an MPhil and then convert to PhD? Or not? What are the criteria for upgrade to PhD?
What are the responsibilities of the supervisor? What are my responsibilities? What is the university's policy on supervision? Is there a policy of joint supervision? Are new supervisors mentored by experienced supervisors? What are the procedures for monitoring my progress? Whom do I go to if I have problems? What are the procedures for assessment? What are the grounds for appeal? Thesis writing group discussion. What answers have your peers found to these questions? How have responsibilities, assessment, etc. been defined? How are the answers reflected in your plans of work? Have any questions not been answered? Do you have other questions? 44. 1. Thinking about writing a thesis. Supervisor. Note that while codes begin to define many aspects of the doctorate, each element is subject to further definition. For example, If the code states that the student is responsible for maintaining regular contact with the supervisor, this only begins to define the role, raising further questions about the definition of regular and contact that will be expected and used by any individual student or supervisor. It is not unusual for both student and supervisor to have different definitions in mind, at least initially. Presumably these definitions can change over time, as the student becomes more expert and experienced, and as the study moves towards completion. At later stages, a key question will be what is meant by monitoring of progress. How will your progress be monitored? It would be as well to have established and agreed milestones and goals at an early stage. There may also be department processes. You may have to provide an annual report, or it could be at 9 or 18 months. The idea of having more than one oral examination may sound tough, but the early report plus mini viva process can be more useful than anything else at teaching you what you know and what you need to do next. Students who have been through such a process report that it made them really make sure that they understood what they were writing. They also found the mini viva useful practice for the real thing. There will also be guidelines on layout for the thesis. Start using them in all your writing, right from the start. Writing your annual report. What are the absolute requirements, length, contents, structure? How much writing is required? Can you see examples of written reports? How will it be assessed? What are the criteria? What kind of feedback can you expect? From whom? When? Will there be any follow-up? An oral examination? How will performance outcomes be recorded? Will your deficiencies be constructively identified and addressed? What is the required layout? What is the required size of left and right margins? Where must page numbers appear on the page? How much space is required at the top and foot of the page? Are there regulations about widows, etc.? Regulations 45. While the final copy of your thesis will be single-sided and double-spaced, you can probably get away with single-spaced for your drafts, but it is worth checking with your supervisor. How does your supervisor want to see your writing? In addition to your university's guidelines, you will be required to follow a particular style sheet. This is detailed rules that you have to follow in presenting your text, references, etc. It is crucial that you find this out before you do much, or any, writing, since changing it all later, when you do have a fair amount of text, will simply be a waste of your precious time. How will it look on the page? You may think it is a bit early to be thinking about final layout, but there are certain requirements. Certain features of your thesis are fixed. If you do not use the required format from the start, you will waste a lot of time later, just when you feel you have least time, changing format, layout, etc. More importantly, this is another facet of defining your writing task. For the final layout, see your university's guidelines or higher degree regulations or library requirements. They will probably specify required, not optional, margins, page numbering system, title page layout, etc. Follow this to the letter. Even minor differences from the required format can cause your thesis to be rejected by the library. For example, if you are required to write the university name on the title page in a particular way, such as the University of Strathclyde, Glasgow, then that is exactly what to do. None of the following is acceptable. The University of Strathclyde at Glasgow. The University of Strathclyde, Glasgow. The University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. That comma must be there. That is how detailed your attention to the requirements must be. It is as rigorous a process as submitting your manuscript to a publisher, which, in a sense, is exactly what you are doing. Although the university is not actually a publishing house, nevertheless the university's name is attached to, and forever associated with, your thesis. The university has to uphold the highest standards, right down to the presentation of the finished thesis that will sit on the library shelves and be accessed by other researchers. 46. 1. Thinking about writing a thesis. Demystification, codes and guides. The criteria for success and failure in the PhD cannot be reduced to a set of written rules, however explicit. Knowledge of regulations, codes and guides does not guarantee success, but it does begin to demystify the thesis writing process. Students are often unaware of how codes of practice can affect their writing process. Supervisors are sometimes unaware of the content, or even existence, of such codes. Students and supervisors alike have been known to assume that these are not relevant in our discipline. It is worth checking that. For the purposes of this book, I assume that students will not be interested in the competing policies and politics of all the organizations that shape the current state of postgraduate study in the UK and beyond. However, selected codes and guides are useful in that they define the research process and requirements for the thesis. They define modes of monitoring and/or criteria for assessment. Taken together, they are part of the demystification process. In any system of higher education, in addition to regulations for the degree, there are bound to be codes of practice and guidelines. These are issued by a number of different bodies with different interests in research and educational outputs: government offices, the universities' associations, employers, professional groups, students' associations and quality assurance groups who may represent, and may or may not be staffed by, any of these other groups, playing a particular role. These provide the ground rules. They also direct you to writing that you can do in the early stages. You can translate questions they raise and criteria they recommend into prompts for writing. Any code or guide produced by your university must be central to your research and your writing. Relative importance of codes and guides. Demystification, codes and guides 47. What follows in this section is an overview of some of these groups in the UK context. There will be other such groups in other national contexts. Each of these codes and guides is examined for their potential influence on thesis writing. A number of different agencies and groups issue codes and guides that may or may not be relevant or useful for your study or writing. Some are more official than others. Some prioritize students' interests. Others are concerned with quality assurance, also of importance to students, but whose importance is not always obvious to students. A key question, for all students, would be which one are operating in your institution, if any. A likely priority would be to get hold of your institution's code of practice. The Quality Assurance Agency produces a code of practice for the assurance of academic quality and standards in higher education. With effect from the year 2000, CA will expect that individual institutions will be in a position to demonstrate how they are meeting the expectations contained in the precepts of this code. The precepts are a set of statements, given a little further definition in a few guidelines. 12 topics are covered. 1. General principles. 2. The research environment. 3. Promotional information. 4. The selection and admission of students. 5. Enrollment and registration of research students. 6. Student information and induction. 7. The approval of research projects. 8. Skills training. 9. Supervision. 10. Assessment. 11. Feedback. 12. Evaluation, complaints and appeals. Some of these may seem of more interest to students than others, but it can be interesting to see what it is that your institution is supposed to be doing in all the administrative stages of your degree. The most interesting topics are skills training, supervision and assessment. 8. Skills training. Institutions will wish to consider the development of language support and academic writing skills. 48. 1. Thinking about writing a thesis. The words should consider clearly indicate that this is not about enforcement, but it is becoming more and more common for universities to require some form of training of new supervisors. Continuing staff development for supervisors would, I expect, be more rare. The second section indicates that monitoring, a critical process, should follow some kind of framework. 9. Supervision. Supervisors should possess recognized subject expertise. Institutions should consider The provision of training for supervisors and continuing staff development. Research students should receive support and direction sufficient to enable them to succeed in their studies. Institutions will wish to consider how to ensure that there is a framework for regular supervisor-research-student interaction, with a minimum frequency of scheduled review meetings between the student, supervisor and, if appropriate, other individuals. Students are introduced to other researchers in their field. Participation in institutional and external discussion forums is encouraged, with the presentation of research outcomes where relevant. 10. Assessment. Postgraduate research assessment processes should be communicated clearly and fully to research students and supervisors. Institutions will wish to consider the mechanisms used for communicating procedures relating to the nomination of examiners,